Steve, thanks for being here. Over the years, too, I mean, this has been also a passion of mine, an interest of mine. There's numbers of times where either I'd kind of look on Steve's website to find out what he's been thinking lately, or even try to get a hold of you in some way and, kind of draw whatever wisdom I could out of you. But let's back up a little bit, because I would love for just to hear kind of some of your story, and because you have, I mean, you kind of pursued this back in the 80s. So give us just a little bit of your story, like why have you been so fascinated with movements?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing looking back is if you want to become an expert on something, right, find something that nobody else is talking about, master it as quickly as possible, and then you've got those 10,000 hours, and you can blitz the field. And that was one of those strange things, the theme sort of found me, rather than I was somehow looking for it. I was a church planter. We'd been sent out from quite a large church in Melbourne, Australia, and we'd planted, and God had blessed it. And, it probably started when he decided to, and this was one of the most successful church plants ever in my denomination's history. Okay, so you can imagine the sort of person I was, how godly I was with the, success at my fingertips. And in the second year of the church plant, the Lord just decided to shake me and shake the church a bit. And I heard this echo. I think it came from John Wimber. Jesus wants his church back again. And he also wanted me back again. Now, he blessed, and I'm sure we were all delighted in what he'd done, and the church hung together, and we went on from that point. But for a few months, he had my attention big time. And I went that journey, and I think I discovered the whole movements thing as a byproduct of that deeper work that God wanted to do in me and in the life of the church. So, and that's a theme we see recurring with movement pioneers, is every now and again God's just got to shake us, and not so much to give us the strategy, but to give us the heart, to bring us back. Otherwise, ministry and success, what I thought was success, it can ruin us.
Absolutely. So now on this particular book too, I'm going to just flash the cover here, Pioneering Movements.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different than the previous two books. So why Pioneering Movements? Why was that an important addition to what you've already written?
Well, especially the first book was on, I spent the next 20 years just reading and looking in real time at, today, contemporary examples of movements. I actually visited Oscar about 6 or 7 years ago, and he and what he's doing there at Nairobi Chapel appears in the first book. And we got the principles, and they're accurate, okay? But then I finished all of that, and I'd just done a trip to see firsthand a movement in southern China with one of our workers there. And I came out of China, and I'm sitting down with a couple of guys called Smith in Singapore, and they're saying, yeah, that's what we see. Those same 5 things, we see them all the time.
And the 5 things you're speaking about, that's in your first book, right?
Yeah.
Movements that change the world.
Yes.
And they are, real quick, they are...
White-hot faith, commitment to a cause, contagious relationships, rapid mobilization, and adaptive methods.
Right. Which, I'm telling you, all church plant, it's worth everybody's read. It's a great, great read. Go ahead.
And those things are rock solid.
Yeah.
It's just, I think we'd have to say, we all want to see those things. So we saw those, and then I said to him, but I've just come out of China, and I think I've missed one. And they said, well, what would that be? And I said, apostolic leaders, leaders who are seeing cities and regions and nations, and they're not just planting and pastoring churches, they're multiplying churches. And they looked at me like, who is this guy? And they just said, well, we've never seen a movement without apostolic leadership. And at that point I thought, it's too late to change the book. And I just put that thought aside. The book came out, and now finally, it's probably about 10 years later, finally it's time to write that story of apostolic leadership.
So speaking of a bunch of church planners or people that are passionate church planning, give us just to break it down a little bit. When you talk about pioneering or movement pioneers, give us some synonyms for that. Like so we can get a handle. Okay, so what does that look like, especially if that's now one of those 6 critical components to what makes a movement?
Yeah. they're people who have that in a biblical sense, the function, the apostolic function. So they don't write scripture, and they haven't necessarily personally witnessed the resurrection, okay? But they're doing everything else a Paul or a Peter or a Barnabas or a Silas or a Timothy would do. Their catalysts are especially going into unreached parts of the world, and that includes, neighborhoods and segments of society here in Chicago or in Illinois. And they're catalysts for multiplying movements of disciples and churches. So, yes, they're modeling what it means to be a shepherd or a leader, an evangelist, all of those things.
The rest of the APEST.
Yeah, they're modeling those things, but most of all, they're looking and releasing those gifts of leadership in the body of Christ, and they're actually thinking about where they go, where they move on to next.
Okay, and now as you describe that though, because you mentioned Peter and you mentioned Paul, and a little bit ago you mentioned John Wimber. So, I mean, does anybody in this room have that gift? Because that's pretty big time.
Well, one of the case studies I did was Victor Landreau down in Colombia. Very few people have heard of him, and I think he might have come to faith in the 60s. He's a brothel owner and a bar and a brothel. That was his business, and a drunkard. Long story, but he comes to Christ.
A bar, a brothel, and a drunkard?
Yeah. He eventually married one of his 3 wives, I think, or something, 3 women. That the other 2 didn't want to accept Christ, so that made it clear, well, I'll marry this one. He doesn't know what he's supposed to do, so he just reads his Bible and he starts sharing the gospel. Friends and family start coming. But pretty soon we've got networks of disciples and new churches all throughout the region. Well, he's not a John Wesley or something.
Right.
Most people haven't heard it. Well, for every John Wesley, there's hundreds of people like that who are just working away, and so they're not necessarily. You do get the John Wesleys, but they wake up in the morning and they're thinking, how can we find people who are far from God? How can we multiply disciples and churches? So they may start the first church, but they're typically thinking, okay, how can I raise up new and existing believers to go and do what I do?
Okay, now as you describe that doesn't seem quite as unusual.
Yeah.
It seems a little more common. I remember a conversation I had with Alan Hirsch, and Alan was talking about this. He said, Ephesians even was actually written more to really a house church. And so if you understand that Ephesians was actually written to a house church, maybe, I'm making this up now, 30 or 40 people? Then, let me finish this and you can give me the numbers. Then when you talk about the APEST, the gifts of apostle, prophet, shepherd, and teacher, it probably exists within almost every small group. How would you respond to that?
Pretty hard to tie down a movement pioneer to be a small group leader.
Okay.
So in Ephesus, typically I'd say it was a citywide network of reproducing churches.
Okay.
That's most likely in those cities. And if you're really wealthy, you could fit 30 to 50 people in, but you're in the top 1%.
Okay.
So a lot of people are meeting in fairly small groups. I'm not looking for an apostle in it, because you can't tie down any apostle worth their salt, even to one local church.
Yeah.
They might be there for a period, reporting back or getting it established, but they're thinking, Paul's thinking when he's at Ephesus, not just how do we reach a city of 200,000, but he's thinking now I've got Epaphras up in Colossae and Laodicea and Hierapolis. He's planting churches up there, and I'm training and doing outreach here in the school of Tyrannus, but throughout, the scriptures say throughout the whole of the region of Asia Minor, sort of Western Turkey, that whole region's hearing the gospel because of the workers that Paul's sending out. He's thinking on that sort of scale. Now, yes, you could say maybe Epaphras doing those has got an apostolic gift because he's
okay.
whole. But no, I wouldn't say. I love Alan, but I'm not expecting there has to be an apostle in every single church or home group.
Okay.
And I'm going to lean towards the function more than I've got a gift, because, well, what are you doing? A lot of people with an apostolic, they don't know how to word for it, but they just do it. Like this guy, Victor, he probably never called himself. Now, you can do that if you want. Don't put it on a business card. But it's more of a function. And then the other thing is, you look around Paul, there's 100 names in the New Testament associated with his ministry. And 36 of them are leaders. They're on the small apostolic team or they're local workers. So every apostles, movement pioneer, they're putting to work just a whole host of people. And in that sense, that ministry is apostolic.
Okay.
Even if they don't get the title. Because they're moving, they're sort of transferring in and out of his team for key projects.
All right, let me make this. I loved what you did in chapter 6, and I'll tell you, if you decide to pick up this book, it's worth it just to pick up the book just for chapter 6. In chapter 6, basically what you do is you talk about 6 levels of movement leadership.
Yeah.
And you break this down, and you have simple graphics. It's easy and it's to understand. And what I looked at it, and it looks like kind of a leadership path for a young apostolic leader. Now, can we just take just a moment?
Yeah.
And why don't you give me 1 minute on each of these?
Okay.
And here's the 5 different levels. You talk about a seed sower, and then a church planter, and then a church multiplier, and then a multiplication trainer, and then level 5, you says, is a movement catalyst.
Yeah.
All right? Why don't you talk just a little bit, explain what each of those do. So, and I think, because there's some of us in this room that I think really have the gifting where they could move through each of those levels. So you start with a seed sower. What's a seed sower?
Okay. It's somebody who knows how to connect with people far from God and share the gospel and lead someone to Christ, and even the early steps in discipleship. The great thing about this is you will grow apostolic leaders, but you can also grow hundreds and thousands of ordinary believers who are the foot soldiers in a movement. If you just make sure, does everybody who's willing to, if they love Jesus, have a pulse, they're willing to learn, how many of our people know how to connect with someone far from God and share their story or a Bible story or something of the gospel and make a new disciple?
So everybody could be a seed sower.
Yes.
Okay, then the next one, level 2, is church planter. How do you move to that?
Okay. That's the ability not only to make individual disciples, but help new disciples form into a group. And ideally, those people, it's a pre-existing network of relationships. So when you find somebody who's responsive to the gospel, it's like the woman at the well. You want to see the gospel go to their village rather than, we've got a group over here in our church for single mothers. So we'll drag her out of her world and we'll you just sit there and we'll look after you. Now, some single mums need that. Some dads need that. But no, how can the gospel go to a village? And that person then is a catalyst to see a group of new disciples come together and discover what church is, discipleship and church. Now, in a movement, I'll get in trouble for saying this, you don't pay anyone to plant a church. In a movement, that's what lay people do in their spare time.
Okay, so you got a seed sower, church planter, and then the third level then becomes church multiplier.
Church multiplier. Now, here's the road to the 10,000.
Yeah.
The road to the 10,000.
What's the 10,000?
Your 10,000.
Okay, just clarifying.
The road to the 10,000 is becoming a parent, a grandparent, a great-grandparent. So it's actually a multiplier. Can not only pioneer a new group of disciples that becomes church, they can help people from within that church form a new church with new disciples. And once you see 4 generations consistently in a network like that, you're in the middle of a church planting movement. So your target to get to 10,000 is just 4.
Okay.
So typically, when we lead someone to Christ, when we form a new group of disciples, when we form a new church, are we getting to 4th generation? So that person is a church multiplier, and you're allowed to pay them. What's the next one?
Okay, so we got seed sower, church planter, church multiplier, and to me it seemed like at this point there's a significant kind of transition because now the next in level 4 you're talking about a multiplication trainer.
Yeah. So if you can imagine a church multiplier having typically a stream of 4. Now some of those streams are ending because the group didn't reproduce. But what the multiplication trainer does is they can help a number of streams of fourth generation churches start. So it might be my mate Troy here. He's done the fourth generation. He's seen that down in Florida. But now he's coaching and equipping other church planters to get to fourth generation. And now they're seeing, and this is the other number you can think of, can we get to 6 streams of fourth generation? Then you're in something that's almost unstoppable. And so a multiplication trainer is seeing, they can say, we have got multiple streams now, and I'm not doing that. I'm coaching and training and mentoring the key leader who is.
Okay, then the last level, you take it to a whole nother level, and you talk about a multiplication catalyst.
Okay.
So seed sower, church planter, church multiplier, multiplication trainer, now multiplication catalyst. What's that?
Okay. It's the next step on, and it might be somebody who says, I want to see no place left here in Chicago. Is this Chicago, by the way?
Yes.
Yeah, we call it Chicago. Okay. So we're going to have to see multiple streams and mobilize all sorts of people to get to that Romans 15. Paul said, no more place. There's no place left for me. My job is done. And he was at that level 5. And it's not just a matter of, well, we've reached most people. It's actually, wow, we've got some Kurds here, I'm guessing, in Chicago. Have we got a multiplication stream amongst them? Who can I mobilize and get on board to see that happen? So they're saying, for me, it's Chicago or I die. Or they're saying Western China, it's the Uyghurs. Or they're saying throughout the US, we want to reach Persians, Iranians. And in order to do that, multiple streams across a geographic area or one single people group. That's what we're looking at.
I'll tell you what, too. I mean, again, I would encourage you, and I'm not trying to sell Steve's books, but that chapter 6 is worth the price of the book there. I think that's just terrific stuff.
Can I say one? I'll say one thing quickly. It's not based on Steve's great theory. It's based on solid actual movements that we're seeing that are multiplying in North India through a guy called Nathan Shank. And we're beginning to see throughout the US with No Place Left and a guy called Jeff Sundell.
Very good. All right, I'll tell you what, let's see if we got a couple questions here. Eric, did you get anything on Twitter?
No, actually, I haven't had anything come through Twitter yet. So
okay.
I guess what I'd like to do is ask someone to raise their hand if you have a question for Steve that we can ask him in regards to the subject. And you can just kind of go like this, and I'll come to you with the microphone, and we'll see where we're at in the conversation. All right, I got a gentleman over here. Going to come around. Coming to you. Here we go.
Yeah, so in regards to your the conversation earlier about apostles, that you wouldn't consider them being tied down to a small group. Am I wrong then to consider that maybe an apostle who's just developing that gift might actually find the small group as a good training ground to be able to really hone their skills before they go and do a major thing like that?
Yep. And what I'd strongly encourage is don't focus on the gift or the title, focus on the function. So what do movement pioneers, movement catalysts do? Because just because you fill out a questionnaire and now I've got this gift or this title, that's not really how it works. I mean, Paul says, you really want to claim this title? Do you know what we go through? Do you know what it's like to have, So he's looking at character, he's looking at function more than he's sort of looking at, I got something on the business card. And that's where those 5 levels just start. If somebody thinks they're just start connecting with people far from God. Start making disciples, start forming new disciples into new churches. Start helping others multiply that. Well, okay, we'll begin to say, maybe there's a gift rising to the surface here.
Okay. Anybody else? Questions?
We have a question over here.
Okay, sure. Go ahead, Steve.
So, Dave, you were talking that in this country there are no churches, I think, that are leading movements, right? Wasn't that one of the things you said as you went through?
I think Steve's telling me I'm wrong.
Right. So I'm really interested in just knowing, okay, so this is happening in other places in the world, and if it isn't happening in the United States, why isn't it? And what does it take? Why is the United States different than other places? And if it is happening, what is that looking like?
It's beginning to happen. And so in the book, you'll see some case studies, and we talk about Jeff, but also other leaders. There's another case study that Troy's involved in. I just hadn't met Troy early enough to get it into the book, but down in Southwest Florida. You don't want to sort of name it and claim it too early, because you want to see, okay, we're beginning to see good signs, all right? We're beginning to see those multiple generations. We're beginning to see leaders come up from the harvest. So I think there's a good chance you will see it happen in the US. Why is it less likely to happen in the Western world? We're fairly secularized, and so is the church. We've lost our confidence in the gospel. And also there's a sociological, relationships have broken down in our culture, so it's a lot harder to see multiplication take place. That's still a bedrock principle and key. So it's a lot tougher in Europe. I'm based in Britain now, but the principles still apply. And every now and again, God throws in a game changer. So the principle, because these are not just these are solid biblical principles. I'll give you another reason, to be honest. I'm not starting with the movement thing. I'm starting with the principles. And when I wrote the first book, we got the principles right. Okay, we could add apostolic leadership. That's what I discovered as we went out and trained and mobilized. People got the vision. Nothing's happening. Virtually nothing. And I realized the missing link, and this is why I wrote the second book, what Jesus started, is nobody knows what to do on Monday morning. And I would add into that what I call the missional fog. That somehow that word, I think, it's like the word love. It's become so much, and it almost has lost its meaning. And it's become so broad and so vague. What Michelle and I learned is sooner or later you have to do what Jesus did and go out and connect with people far from God and share with them and call them to follow Jesus, and then help them to become a disciple who helps other people follow Jesus. And most of our people, and we're responsible for this, don't know what to do on Monday morning. They just know they've been exhorted, they've been told, they've been envisaged, and they just don't know what to do. And we can train them. And as soon as we start training and modeling and equipping people, people start coming to faith, even in the West, immediately.
Let me throw a couple more questions at you. And by the way, too, if you want to go ahead and throw it out there on Twitter with using the hashtag NTG15, Steve, I think you agreed that you said you'd love to follow up on these questions via Twitter, too. So if you're thinking about this later on, go like, oh, dang, I should have asked him. You can hit him up that way. Okay, so you end the book in the last chapter, chapter 10. You really finish with it's a powerful and provoking question. What would it take to stop you?
Yeah.
What would it take to stop you? What were you getting at, and why did you choose to end the book like that?
I think it was a balance from our emphasis on movements and multiplication, seeing that a pattern in the lives of movement pioneers in Scripture and throughout history and today is at some point they're going to find something that just stops them in their tracks, that I can't go any further. They're going to find, and sometimes it's a personal tragedy, sometimes it's just, I cannot see the breakthroughs. I cannot make this thing happen. And to see, that if it's going to be a movement of God, it's going to have the shadow of the cross over it, both the cross and the resurrection. And for Paul, this is weakness, this is power in weakness. That somehow we have to be what we're trying to multiply. And especially, every Christian's got to face this, but especially movement pioneers. there will be key times where you face a personal tragedy, or you're a deep conflict in the ministry, or a health, or whatever it is that could easily unmake you as a leader and even as a person. And we think the enemy is that thing we're facing, when the reality is this: God is opening you up to a deep work, a very costly work, because this is the journey of his son. And this is the example of Paul and virtually every other movement pioneer I've looked at. And so you've got to be prepared for the battle, and you've got to be prepared for this weakness in power thing. Because if God is going to entrust us with seeing whole cities and nations and people groups won, we've got to know his power, and we have to also know that it's power and weakness. This message of the cross becomes part of us. And it's both a task and a challenge, and it's a gift because it sets you free.
Yeah. And I get the sense as you're talking there that, specifically, that's kind of a word for some of us in this room. Right
Yep,
there.
it will be.
Let me ask you this. I would love for you to do this. Take 2 minutes or so and kind of wrap up. You have become a friend of NewThing and of mine, and you know a little bit about NewThing and kind of some of the things that we're about, what we'd love to see God do through us. Just speak as candidly as you would, and challenge and kind of challenge us, going like, here's some things you guys and girls are doing great at, but here's some things you need to really be aware of. Just kind of challenge us.
I think you've got the vision thing, and you keep revisiting the 30,000 foot view.
Mm-hmm.
I would say you've got to learn the micro thing.
The micro thing.
The micro thing.
What people do on Monday morning.
What people do on Monday morning. So this morning, I get up this morning and Troy says, Steve, let's do the micro thing. And we're walking and we're just doing what we call the 3/3. It's a discovery Bible study process, and we're in 1 Thessalonians 2. And what is it saying to us? How's Jesus revealed in this? What do we need to do? We're just applying it to our lives, and we're both concluding, and everybody in a movement is doing this. They know what the 3/3 are. They can do discovery Bible study, obedience-orientated discipleship. It's bread and butter. And then Troy and I are saying, like Paul, we need to be upfront with the gospel. We walk into the Apple store because the real reason I came was to buy the iPhone 6S. And we're working out, and we'll call the attendant Susie. And while we're sorting it out, Troy's connected, and he said, well, has anyone ever explained the gospel to you? And as we're doing credit cards and all of that, he's just doing a little thing we call the 3 circles, a great way to share the gospel. And she's just riveted. And we're praying for her, and she's a single mom, praying for her son who's got a health issue, and talking about how she could grow in a relationship with Jesus as she begins reading the gospel stories with her son, 5 years old. We stepped out of it because it was all done, and we left, and then I came back because I wanted to download some stuff in the store. She stops what she's doing to come over and just keep talking to us, okay? Now, can anyone, not just in this room, but the people you influence, how many have you trained to share their story, to do a discovery Bible study with somebody who's far from God? We call it the early offer of prayer. Mm-hmm. We offered in the Apple store to pray for Susie and her son. And then, do they know how to transition out of that and just say, hey, at the moment in your life, are you near or far from God? It's a wonderful question. And would you like to be nearer? Yeah, I would. She said, we talked about brokenness. She said, I'm broken, I said, well, can I tell you how I was far and came near? Have you trained your people in that? In this room, you could have thousands of people that you would train. And even if only a quarter of them begin to go, and I assure you, people will come to Christ next week because you've trained them. And they know how to make a disciple doing discovery Bible study. There's some of the micro things, but how you make the first disciple will determine whether it's a movement or not.
So what I'm hearing you say, you look at NewThing, you're going, hey, great job on the 30,000 foot, great job on the vision, good job on mobilizing people with apostolic function and gifts. But what about the thousand people who wake up on Monday morning? How are you mobilizing? How are you training? What are they doing? And that's the thing we need to go to work on.
This is what changes you. Because I wrote the first book without doing this stuff until my wife beat me up big time. I got a word from the Lord through my wife. It's an awful experience, guys. Steve, it's a great book. When are you going to do something? And I couldn't be offended because it was God. So you step out in fear and trepidation and weakness, okay? You have the skills because you've trained and practiced your people. They step out or you step out. This is what changes you forever. It's actually not Chicago or North America or Kenya. It's I stepped out and Jesus turned up and touched a life. That's what actually your people will not be motivated by 10,000.
Yeah.
They'll be motivated because they actually love people. Yeah. You know, we see that. They will be motivated about Susie at the Apple store and her son. Right. That's what we signed up for, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got to train. You've got to take a risk. You've got to, Troy's holding me accountable, and we're going to do this stuff. But what changes us all is Jesus rose from the dead and still leads the way. He's there he's already there.
In the Apple store.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, let's say thanks to Steve. Great stuff.
Thank you.